second keynote speaker for this evening. And I am very honored to welcome him here in the 7-day workshop, IKS workshop on Advances in Consciousness Studies, Indian and Cross-Cultural Perspectives. Thank you, Professor Sthaneshwar Timalsina, for joining us. And let me take this privilege to introduce him formally. Dr. Sthaneshwar Timalsina is presently holding Nirmal K. and Augustine Matto Endowed Chair in Classical Indic Humanities at Stony Brook University, New York. After completing his master degree from Sampurna Ananda Sanskrit University, Dr. Timalsina opened the Department of Tantric Studies in Nepal and taught there for several years before joining Martin Luther University in Halle. Dr. Timalsina completed his PhD in 2005 with a focus on Advaita Philosophy. While working on his dissertation, he taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Washington University. He has specialization on Hindu studies, comparative philosophies, and religion. Since 2005, he has been teaching in both the Department for the Study of Religions and Department of Philosophy at San Diego State University. In his writings and thought, Dr. Timalsina webs his classical training with his philosophical training in his own unique style of comparative and analytical studies. He published his dissertation in 2006 under the title Seeing and Appearance, A History of Advaita Doctrine of Drishti Srishti. He expanded his research into the area of consciousness studies, resulting in the book Consciousness in Indian Philosophy, published by Routledge. He then shifted his attention to tantric studies and published 2 books on language and language of images, meaning and visualization in tantras, and tantric visual culture, a cognitive approach, from Routledge. In addition to these books, he has published more than 80 articles in the areas of Hindu philosophy, tantric studies, yoga studies, and comparative philosophy. He writes in both Sanskrit and English. His Sanskrit works reflecting classical mystic philosophers such as Abhinavagupta. His works, Tantra, draws upon the esoteric tradition of Tripura and synthesis Shakta philosophy, whereas the short of treatise captures essential Kola and Karma Tantrism. In order to disseminate philosophical knowledge distilled from various Hindu schools of thought, Professor launched the Vimarsha Foundation in 2009, and since then he has continued to offer regular full courses through this forum. Professor envisions Vimarshas as a global school gurukul for learning classical Sanskrit-based philosophical system and mystical tradition. That's really nice. And today, he is making a presentation. He's making a presentation on consciousness is like fire, Panpsychism, and Puruṣavāda. I welcome you, sir, once again, and I thank you for accepting our invitation. And now it's over to you, sir.
Thinking about consciousness, it's so amazing that we hear so many different ideas today, and consciousness has gained popularity and not notoriety in the last 2 decades or so. Before, consciousness was not viewed as much of a serious topic for consideration, and most of the physicalists maintained that everything about human nature, everything about consciousness will be explained within a decade, and we'll have to, I guess, wait for a long time to have that reductionist explanation of consciousness, or hopefully never, because I do not believe that explaining our neurological states will suffice to explain our experience or the conscious event. Talking about consciousness also has two different strands of thoughts coming together. One is what is happening in the Western conversation and how we working in Indian philosophy can contribute to this global discourse on consciousness. For multiple reasons. Number one, Indian philosophy has been hardly even in a footnote for mostly the philosophical discourse in the West. And if we did not have sufficient materials, that would be okay. But in spite of so much of writing and literature and so many dozens of philosophers contributing to consciousness studies for the millennia, we still lack in having a complete engagement with in the global scale. And I think that that is the main project necessary for us to involve right now. And the second thing is consciousness is a universal topic. It does not involve necessarily any nation state or any particular culture, and not even humans, because consciousness is to explain consciousness is to explain the core of our being. Having said that, we have seen multiple extremes. I myself worked for a good time on one of the extremes on Puruṣavāda. The professor right before me said that he will take the route of Srishti Drishti and explain the phenomenal Vyavahara Satya as a Satya, which is great. But let's entertain Drishti Srishti, because Madhusudana Saraswati or many other Advaitins declare that Drishti Srishti is the primary Advaita Mukhyaha Vedanta Siddhanta. That's the primary Advaita doctrine. Or go to Yogacara or many other philosophies, whether Madhyamaka. I believe that when we try to explain consciousness by reducing materiality, we are not explaining the phenomenal. And when the other approach of physical reductionism is to reduce consciousness to matter, is not really explaining consciousness. It's simply evading the issue of consciousness by reducing consciousness to simple material states. I am more and more convinced that we need to explore for the philosophical positions that stemmed globally. And if we are looking for Indian materials, maybe in the writings of Ramanuja or in the writings of Abhinavagupta or in some other writings that we have not paid as much attention as in the philosophy of Śaṅkara, for example, where we might find a sort of a harmony to explain the world without reducing to consciousness, or to explain consciousness without reducing to materiality. And for that matter, I found that maybe we can entertain to some extent the idea of Panpsychism or Cosmopsychism. But that doesn't mean that I'm convinced with any of these ideas either. Ultimately, I believe that the doctrine of Abhivyakti, emergence, or manifestation in whatever the form we explain, does have the potential to explain consciousness in much better platform than most of these emerging theories. And for this, I have traced in the published article, the literature that Mallavadin, a prominent Jaina philosopher from 6th century or so, addresses, in which he's simply trying to critique the Advaita philosophy, but what he critiques is a doctrine he calls Puruṣavāda. And in this Puruṣavāda, he cites, as if if you read the passages, it appears that he's directly citing from the Purusha Sukta, and the expositions go beyond Purusha Sukta looking passages to Vakyapadiya Vritti of Bhartrihari and similar texts, some of which I'm afraid are lost today. But when I kept working further, I found that the conversation of Janaka and Sulabha has some nuance to it to add. I borrowed the metaphor for the title, Consciousness is like fire, from this very conversation of Janaka and Sulabha. This Sulabha, easy to access, is a hermit who intrudes the senate of King Janaka. It's the story in Mahabharata. Most of us do know that by heart. And in this, he brings a perspective. That perspective is the way the fire burns. I'm taking this metaphor rather seriously. There are 3 or 4 metaphors that she gives to explain consciousness. I would like to first talk about that and then see whether this is panpsychism or physical reductionism or whatever the way we can explain. The first example is of fire and the fire log. So when we have friction, the fire log ignites and we have the fire. But was there fire before ignition? No, there was no fire. But can you decisively say there was no fire and then the fire comes out of nowhere? No, all that is required for the energy was already there in the latent form. And that is just manifest in the specific form of fire when we ignite. So the fire logs and the fire are not two diametrically opposite entities. And it's not that you can just have the friction of anything and then have the fire. But this fire log is giving us the possibility, the power intrinsically embedded within the materiality. So if my conscious state is something akin to the ignition of the fire log, having fire, then this body, my physicality, is not some type of a diametrical opposite to having the state of consciousness. But if this consciousness and our physicality are not to be viewed as 2 different entities, but a continuum, then what we have is the conscious states can manifest and can remain unmanifest. And for that matter, again, I will give you the examples from the Dvadasarana Chakra of Mallavadin, where he goes to describe state consciousness, avastha. And this state consciousness or avastha is essential to Gaudapada's analysis of the Mandukya. And in this, we have the waking state of consciousness, sleeping state, dreaming state, and then the 4th or the transcendent Turiya state of consciousness. So what he explains is not that we as conscious subjects have 4 different states of consciousness, but what he maps is these 4 states explain the totality, that maybe animals are in some type of dreamy states, maybe plants are in some deep sleepy states, and then it goes beyond that. The conscious states, nothing exists in the world that is bereft of having that consciousness, but consciousness is such that it can manifest or it can remain unmanifest. So this approach of consciousness is stoked in everything that exists, can still have a sort of a duality, that there is this consciousness soaking something that is not consciousness. Materiality is something other than consciousness. But if let's read the Purusha Sutta, Purusha eva idagu sarvam jatkincha jagatyan jagat. So this what is Purusha? Purusha eva chaitanyam. So then in the references that I'm referring, citing from Dvadasarana Chakra or the Mallavadins and other texts similar to that, like Bhakyapadiya Vritti, that is where we find that Purusha is Chaitanya, or consciousness is Purusha, identity there. So in this type of identity, we are getting to the original philosophy of the Hindus, going all the way back to Rig Veda and continuing to explain the world not as opposite to the absolute, but rather an extension or expression of the absolute, that the text goes to explain that just like the sasya, the rice comes or the grass come in the season and they go back to the seed, the same way conscious states manifest and they go back. So what is materiality? There is other metaphor there. The materiality is like the state of turning into ice or vaporization. The water element can be found in different states. So we have the solid and the vapor states, and also fluid state of water. The same way, what we call consciousness is something subtle, and when we call the matter is in this gross tangible form, but that doesn't mean that they are diametrically opposite. So in this regard, I'm thinking that maybe panpsychism can address some of the our philosophies in more relevant terminology. But even within panpsychism, they have not gotten away of this dichotomy that everything has this psychic or mind-like nature. Everything has, meaning everything is endowed with. It's not that everything is. And that is where we have to be careful, that whether panpsychism is yet another form of a dualistic philosophy. And the next point I would say is, for many panpsychists are boiled into this adopting an idea of micro-subjectivity. Like Nagel also tries to argue through, and there are a bunch of philosophers in that line who advocate for or try to defend some form of micro-subjectivity. What do they mean by micro-subjectivity? Is our conscious subjective state is an emergent structure of a collection of different subjectivities in the cellular level, or every neuron has its own subjective state. And when I say I am Sthaneshwar, I'm referring to this collective state of all the micro subjectivities. The problem I notice in this idea is I never feel my subjectivity as an assemblage. I never experience myself as a collective of different pieces. Or when I think of myself, I do not think myself as a collection, a heap. But this singularity of self-consciousness is not just unique to me, my subjectivity, but is unique to every single animal. That the subjective experience is singular and unique and not copyable. We cannot copy the subjective state and not transferable. And so this uniqueness of subjectivity, to argue that it's a product of the collectivity of micro-subjective states, takes a big leap of faith, yet again, of the unexplained phenomena of what does it look like? What is it like to have the micro-subjective state? Or what is it like my singular neuron feels as pain or pleasure? And then is that sensation that is registered in the brain is actually pain or pleasure? Is this simple vibration, pulsation of my neurological state, is it to be interpreted as the experience of pain or pleasure? And of course, I am differing to that these neurological states, if we reduce these physical states to conscious states, we are still, like David Chalmers has already presented, that there is no addressing of the qualia, what it is like to have the conscious state. And if we are trying to engage this phenomenal, the internal, what it is like of consciousness in the conversation of consciousness, even this microsubjectivity model will not help us explain, and even those other dualistic models and the reductionist model of physicalism will not help explain the conscious state. Now, what it is like for us to rethink then Philip Goff has come up with yet another thesis of cosmopsychism, that there is this collective psychic state and our micro state is actually my physical state or my mental state. That let's consider that a micro state of subjectivity, and then there's just a collective consciousness, a singular state of consciousness. I find that more agreeable rather than trying to explain consciousness from the molecular state. I am finding easier to explain it from singularity to our diversification, particularly because many of the classical Advaita texts also explain consciousness from singularity. And if we go to, as mentioned, Srishti Drishti and Ishwara's creation, what is Ishwara? Ishwara is collective consciousness, samashti sharira abhimani of the sushupti. That is what Ishwara is. So basically, the singular subjectivity that collectively experiences all our subjectivities within. So this singular subjectivity is Ishwara, and that imagines, that's like basically in some other texts we find as a projection of Hiranyagarbha, and whether you call Ishwara or Hiranyagarbha, there are subtle differences within the categorization of the states of consciousness in Advaita Vedanta, but overall what we find is the collective breaking down into or splitting into multiple subjectivities. This fragmentation, I'm explaining in terms of Abhivyakti. This Abhivyakti I have also addressed earlier in the conferences, that Abhivyakti, the terminology starts coming all the way from the Mahabharata, but comes to prominence in the writings of Bhartrihari and goes all the way to, you read Shiva Drishti of Somananda and the works of Abhinavagupta. What is Abhivyakti? It is coming into blossoming. So you buy a stick of rose for the rose flower and then put it to ground. And then when the season comes, you have the new stem, and then the blossoming comes and the fragrance comes. So if this little stick of rose did not have the potential to come to blossoming when the season comes, you would not be purchasing or putting your labor to plant that stick in the hope of once seeing the blossoming. Everything in the world, all the materiality has the potential the same way of self-luminosity. How to define consciousness? Its self-awareness is the defining characteristic of consciousness, that consciousness does not require anything else to explain. So we can call this an interiority. What it is like for matter to be matter. This interiority as consciousness, because everything we can do from the physicalist perspective is explaining from its exteriority, what it is like, how does it behave, what is its external attributes, but what it is like within itself, then we can propose that the interiority as it is, as such of the state of being, whether that state of being is in the state of materiality or in the state of consciousness, we can say that that interiority is constituted by consciousnness. And this will help us explain that this fragmentation is what we will call Maya or Avidya. And then there is no objection to explaining from the Advaita perspective either. Rather than trying to use Advaita's Maya or Avidya to explain after fragmentation, to explain the world or to explain Brahman, I believe I'm proposing that we can help explain this fragmentation as a process. Maya is just like covering, avidya, knowing, and in its individuation as the very mechanism of avidya, that we fail to recognize this singularity. And this failing to recognize singularity and giving rise to differentiated modes of subjectivity helps us explain also the epistemic states of how we have the experience of a particular object. Let me say, seeing something in front of me, a pen, a paper, my laptop. So how do I explain this? in this recognizing a singular entity, as long as my focus, my conscious mode is not dedicated to only one object, I would not have this distinction made and a recognition of this is my laptop. But when I am conscious, this is my laptop, what is happening to me is I am as if blocking all the other possible modes. Maybe I'm feeling pain right now, but I am blocking that sensation. Maybe I'm seeing in front of me many other things, the lamp and the pen and the papers and a bunch of things. I am not conscious of it. I have channeled all my consciousness to a singular object. So there is not just a recognition of one entity, there is a gradual suspension of all the other objects given within the scope of consciousness, and only when all the other modes are blocked or suspended, I am given to a singular mode of consciousness. Then there arises, this is this object. There arises my subjectivity too, because when I am conscious of myself is when I suspend all other modes or all other external objects of consciousness, then my subjective state emerges within me. This is me. So this is why this avidya maya doesn't need to be explained as giving something illusory, but as a process of suspending all the other objects or all other possible instances of consciousness so that a particular mode of consciousness can emerge. Because without that suspension, we could never have had a singular object identification. So what we are doing is explaining how the conscious state emerges of like, this is my laptop. And we are saying that there are like a billion neurons triggering, and then there are these multiple pictures of the same laptop, and they are making an assemblage, and that is giving us a singularity. And that is how the mind is interpreting of the millions of pictures. That is good. But when I'm conscious of my surrounding, there's always, like Merleau-Ponty talks at one point about like seeing a house. And that's a very good example that when I see a house, I do not see just the house. I also see the background as if like in a canvas. So there is always the surrounding, that the trees or the mountain or whatever other houses in the background. And then when I recognize, I have this recognition of a singularity, this is the house. And there is a gradual suspension of the other modes of consciousness in this identification. And I believe that we can use the theory of avidya maya to explain this process of differentiation rather than how the assemblage is made, or how the suspension is made of consciousness, and how to explain our conscious state or being in the world. Why am I proposing that these, rather than the mainstream philosophies, these side philosophies might be more useful? Why can't I just do Nyaya? Most of, like B.K. Matilal and Mohanty, most of the eminent philosophers who have come to the West, they have used Nyaya as an example of how we have rationality. And how the advanced state of rational thinking has evolved in classical India. And that's a good project. Number one, a lot has already been said. And number two, I do not believe that the Nyaya interpretation of consciousness is to add any further nuance to what has already been said. And in the field of consciousness, you can read Kishore Kumar Chakrabarti, for example. He has also a book on mind. And likewise, Jonathan Ganeri has written on naturalization of philosophy from the Indian perspective. So you can read some of these works. So between these two extremes, one is a pure Yogacara Sautrantika type way of explaining consciousness by going to some form of subjectivity and subjective illusionism, or going to Drishti Srishti or similar type of philosophy that do not help us explain much about the world and my interrelationship to the world. Even if we do not reject the phenomenality, but the goal has been always about explaining the singularity of consciousness. as a philosopher, we need to have our grounding, our foot on what is immediately given. And what is immediately given is my own physicality. I'm an embodied being, and I feel pain and pleasure. And if my embodiment and if my pain and pleasure are denied in this self-givenness of my singularity, is my solipsistic mode of the self-givenness of consciousness, then we are not actually helping advanced philosophy to have any meaningful dialogue with our physicist friends, for example, or to relate to the real world that has so much to do with our being in the world, our design. So this philosophy that we are working to advance should not run away from our being in the world to our design. And for that, I find that some of these alternative ideas, and they are not as alternative as we might think, because I do believe that actually prior to Śaṅkarācārya, the mode of Upanishadic writing was dominantly following this type of singular, or you can say monistic philosophy. And we can actually work further to rediscover. And for all those working in history of philosophy, this gives an amazing project. And for those who are trying to get away from any type of illusionism or subjectivism, this gives yet another project. And it also helps us be relevant in the global conversation on philosophy and consciousness studies without reducing either to physicalism or to subjectivity. And I would like to stop at that point. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I'm always here, Munmut. You have my full support. And in every account, I'm proud to be part of it. And I am so honored that such distinguished philosophers from India are engaged and trying to bring these classical insights to discourse with global philosophies. And I believe we have a very bright future, and we will have more engaged philosophical conversations in the future. Thank you so much for having me here.